So this session is in two parts. There's a morning session and an afternoon session. So very quickly, I'll take you through the work of the Local Government Capacity Centre. This is the Winter Learning Programme, and it's brought to you by the team. We launched in the summer last year. This slide summarises who we are and what we do. We've launched the centre following extensive research and consultation with you across local government and with a whole range of other partners to determine where authorities need most support and how this can be best delivered. And this is a message from our CEO. So I'm delighted to open this session with a message from our Chief Exec, Peter Denton. As you can see, Peter is committed to ensuring Homes England supports your work and shares expertise, experience and skills to help get homes built. Next slide, please. So this is the very high level agenda for today. We'll have the morning session. We'll hear from John Mather from Homes England. He'll give us the rural context. Then I'm delighted to have Richard Muggleston with us. He's from Midlands Rural Housing, and he'll give us a case study about their work. Then we'll have a break. This is a break for you to have lunch and also to pick up any emails that you need to look at. And then the afternoon session, we'll hear from Matt Dodd, again from Homes England. He'll give us some information on the rural strategy work. And then I'm again delighted to have Alison Thompson, who's from English Rural Housing Association, to give their experience. So next slide, please. I'd like to hand over now to John. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you, Victoria. So John Mather, I'm a Senior Partnership and Business Development Manager with Homes England. But in roles prior to joining Homes England, I've worked with a rural housing association. I've also worked for a local authority in a significantly rural area around housing needs and allocations and statutory homelessness duties. And I've also had a role as a rural housing enabler with a rural community council. So a reasonably extensive background in rural housing and rural affordable housing. If we could move to the next slide, please. So this morning's session, it's my role throughout it's my role this morning to set the context. So this will be a quick canter through the headline issues that face rural areas and rural housing delivery. So there is the opportunity at the end of the session to tell us if there are particular topics within this that would be it would be useful to have a deeper dive at a later date. So this is going to be a skim through with the opportunity for you to tell us if there's something that is worthy of that further examination down the line. Richard is going to tell us about the work of Midlands Rural Housing, working within that rural context. And then in the afternoon, Matt will talk more about Homes England's current strategy around rural housing, with English Rural Housing offering an insight into their work as well. If we could have the next slide, please. So this is just an introduction to the rural context. If we can move on. So just to set your thoughts going, what is your view of the rural population in England? What percentage of England's population lives in rural areas? Is it 7%, 17%, or 27%? We won't hang on long for this, but just to get a quick snapshot. And it's running at the majority around the 27% mark at the moment. Results flying in. Yeah, so over half at 27%. If we could move to the next slide, please. Well, around 9.6 million, which is around 17% of the population in England, live in rural areas. So a little lower than the majority on the poll. But so those that were in the 38% that said 17% of the population were bang on, with the rural economy in England contributing around about 261 billion into England PLC each year. Rural economies are diverse, so it's hard to categorise. Around 8% these are national figures. Around 8% are in agriculture and forestry, 17% in the health and education sector, around 11% in manufacturing. So there is, of course, some strong pockets of tourism in rural parts of England. So Cornwall, for example, the Lake District, parts of Norfolk, for some obvious examples where tourism features heavily in the local economy. Businesses tend to be smaller than urban areas. And one point really to draw out here is that the population in rural areas does tend to be older than urban areas. So the population is not only older in general, but is also aging faster than urban areas within England. If we could just move on, please. So affordability is an issue in many parts of the country, but affordability does take on a different angle in rural England. So some of the most attractive and desirable places to live in the country in England are rural parts of the country, and we can see that in some parts of England, rural house prices are running at 28 or more times income levels. I mean, some of the points to draw out really around affordability, it's a changing picture post-COVID. We are seeing that trend of migration towards rural areas out of urban areas, and it's still fluid. It's still settling down, but it's definitely a changing picture post-COVID. I think there's another point to draw out around rural areas and affordability, and that's the distinction between incomes and locally earned incomes, and this it can be perhaps inferred that some of this is being driven further by the post-COVID kind of migration that's going on, the ability to remotely work and earn, in effect, urban salaries in a rural setting, and what that impact is on affordability locally and the ability of local rural residents to be able to access the housing market. We're yet to see the full impact of that, but there was already a trend towards that in large swathes of the country. In terms of housing need, it's difficult to draw figures at a regional or national level. Housing need in a rural context is often necessarily measured at a settlement level, and drawing those figures into any kind of meaningful national statistics is quite difficult to calculate. And the rural housing sector, the lobbying sector, has made some estimates around that. They are the sector estimates, but we wouldn't be disagreeing with those too vehemently, really. The map on the slide here shows affordability. So the darker the colours, the less affordable housing is in that particular area. So the darkest blue is running at more than 12.5 times incomes, and the lighter shades are around about 6 times incomes. But whilst these are at county level and district level, it can be seen, particularly the sort of swathe across North Yorkshire and into the Lake District, that stands out particularly starkly. The affordability ratios across that sort of rural swathe of northern England, and then down in the far southwest, Cornwall, Devon, and then sort of North Norfolk coast, those sort of areas, beyond the long recognised hotspots around the home counties and the sort of outer London fringes. So whilst that the map shows at a district level and that blankets that sort of masks settlement level variations, that's a broad trend can be clearly seen there. If we could move on, please. So just thinking about how we actually define rural, that's a little bit of a background we've had on on some of the characteristics. But which of the following is a definition of rural? Is it a designated rural area, a designated protected area, settlement with population under a certain number, or any or all of the above? Rocketing in. So nobody's gone for designated, or very few have gone for designated rural areas. Nobody's gone for a designated protected area. Settlements with 3,000 population, about a third of the votes at the moment, and 2/3 have gone for all of the above. So, yeah, slightly trick question. All of the above are our definition of rural. So this is one of the challenges when thinking about rural from a national perspective. How do we define rural? So if we could just move on to the next slide. So there are many definitions of rural in circulation, in use, and appropriate at different points. But I'm just going to draw out 3 different takes on this for this morning's session. So just next slide, please. An academic definition of rural, and this comes from Professor Paul Cloke from 1977, and I find this quite a useful definition. So a condition of place-based homeliness shared by people with common ancestry or heritage who inhabit traditional, culturally defined areas or places statutorily recognised to be rural. So there's a cultural and place-based aspect to rurality in his view, but also acknowledges that there is a statutory role around recognition of rural areas as well. So Professor Paul Cloke, if you've got an academic interest in this, he's worth digging out. He's done a lot of work in rural geography over a number of decades, and particularly around this sort of place versus space argument, and rural homelessness. He had quite an interest in that for a period. But yeah, have a dig if that's of interest to you. If we could move to the next slide, please. So DEFRA offers us a government definition of rural, and there are 6 categorizations of settlements, of areas, sorry, across the country that DEFRA offer us. So the ones that we're interested in then are those named significant rural, rural 50, and rural 80. So these are at local authority level, those categorizations. And so a rural 80, for example, is a local authority in which at least 80% of the population live in a rural area or a small settlement. Equally, a rural 50, 50% of the population, etc., etc. So of the 350 odd local authorities in England, there's currently 60 local authorities that fall into that 80% category. So where 80% of their population at that within that local authority live in a sparse rural or a small settlement. So that's 60 local authorities, and there are 69 that fall into that 50% category. So around about a third of local authorities in England have a population which is at least 50% or even 80% rural. So this is a significant area in terms of land mass within the country, and we've already reflected on the economy and the population that involves. So this is significant in housing terms, and but spread thinly. That's the point being made here, really. If we could move to the next slide. Homes England, we have a long established working definition of rural for our purposes, and particularly in relation to the Affordable Homes Programme, so the grants programme towards affordable housing. We consider that a settlement with a population of fewer than 3,000 is rural. So that's our cut-off, and that is a useful working definition for us when we're thinking about affordable housing. If we could go to the next slide, please. So thinking about bringing forward housing, local authorities, rural areas are often constrained. So this is necessarily a high-level overlook at the constraints faced in rural areas. There will be site-specific considerations, constraints coming forward relating to particular sites, particular developments that are being proposed. But at a national level, there are some really significant and obvious ones. So areas of outstanding natural beauty, the national parks, sites of special scientific interest, and there's other statutory and regulatory protections that come into play when housing and other forms of development are being considered. At a local level, local plan policies can be a constraint around rural development, particularly thinking around policies that incorporate settlement hierarchies that limit growth in the smallest of settlements, looking to encourage and support growth in settlements with more by the way of services, but also, and that clearly is a local policy decision, but local plans can also be a real support and enabler of rural housing delivery as well, particularly thinking about the likes of some good example SPDs that have been produced recently that really set out a local authority's position and how affordable housing can be brought forward, and other forms of market housing as well in rural locations. So the map on the left is it's probably quite obvious, but they are the areas of outstanding natural beauty and national parks across the north of England. And if you recall the affordability map, that swathe of less affordable areas across northern England sweeps right across that. So while they're not completely coterminous, there's obviously a strong correlation between the two there. If we could move to the next slide, please. So introducing the statutory and regulatory background. If we could move on again, please. So designated rural areas, designated protected areas, mentioned in that definitions piece. So these are two statutory protections for affordable housing in rural areas. So designated rural areas came about through the 1985 Housing Act, and they are largely, but not entirely, within the national parks, areas of outstanding natural beauty, and there are other areas within England that are laid down by the Secretary of State. So these can vary. These do get amended and updated from occasionally via the Secretary of State. So new parishes can be included. So these are a parish level or even a part of a parish. So where a whole parish is included, the parish is simply listed, and where there's a part of a parish, there's a very dated, it's fair to say, map which will be drawn where you can determine which parts of the parish actually fall within that designated rural area. These came about to afford protections from right to buy in rural areas where affordable housing, social housing, local authority housing at the time was in and remains in scarce supply. So the map next to the designated rural areas, the blob of purple, it's not very distinct because that is down to parish level. So those are all designated rural area parishes out on the sort of Cornish, Devon peninsula. So not in a national park, but there is, as you can see, a large swathe of designated rural areas in the southwest of England. Designated protected areas are slightly different, cover a different geography, and these were laid down in the Housing and Regeneration Act 2008. And this is a protection particularly around, in practical terms, staircasing and shared ownership. So within a designated protected area, Homes England funded shared ownership homes. The expectation is that the staircasing is limited to 80%, or that there is provision that the housing association will repurchase the shared ownership home from the occupier if it's staircased to 100% and the occupier wishes to sell and move on, thereby retaining that shared ownership home in perpetuity. So the map to the right, the grey areas are designated protected areas. So compare and contrast the southwest of England with the sort of southeast of England and East Anglia. There's quite a different geography to the designated protected areas and designated rural areas across the country. Designated rural areas, which is the older of the two protections, the 1985 protection. Bear this in mind when we come to just briefly talk about first homes, that there's a significance around designated rural areas that has come back into play around first homes. If we could just move on, please. So designated protected area waivers, and this is an area which frequently gives rise to confusion when grant is being sought for affordable homes through Homes England in a designated protected area. So I'm going to attempt to cut through some of that confusion just by explaining exactly what our role is around designated protected area waivers, DPA waivers. So just talked on the previous slide, the assumption is within a designated protected area that a shared ownership home will be retained on a shared ownership basis in perpetuity, either through a restriction on staircasing or the buyback arrangements through the housing association. Excuse me. The local authority concerned, where there is a designated protected area, the local authority can choose at a local level to waive those perpetuity arrangements for shared ownership within a designated protected area. So it's for the local authority to decide whether it wishes to maintain those perpetuity arrangements or whether it is content to allow shared ownership homes to be allowed to exit the affordable sector and enter the open market through staircasing. So if the local authority is content to do that, then the local authority can apply to Homes England for a waiver. So our waiver is not to the designated protected area. We are not waiving the whole of that DPA in that parish. What we are waiving is the requirement within our capital funding guide, effectively the kind of contractual basis of the grant funding, the conditions of the grant funding. We're waiving the condition that funding within a designated protected area for shared ownership homes, the lease has to restrict staircasing. So we're allowing our default shared ownership lease to be used instead, which allows 100% staircasing. So the waiver is not to the DPA. The DPA still stands. The waiver is to our capital funding requirements on the grant on that particular scheme. And we can even sort of ask for plot numbers to be absolutely precise as to which units are being considered for this and which are not. We ask for quite precise drawings to just be absolutely certain which homes are being included within the waiver or not. So there is links through from gov.uk into further guidance on that. and the waiver forms. And our process for administering this is currently under review, and there'll be some release on that over the coming weeks as to actually how that is submitted to us. But at the moment, if you are sort of familiar with that process, do continue to contact your local affordable housing growth manager in the normal way until that's announced. So if we could just move on, please. So this is just included. I'm not going to demonstrate the click through here. This is included so that when you receive the slide deck, you've got the links through here. So to be able to check whether a parish is included within a designated protected area, is a designated protected area or not, then that can be checked through these online lookups through ourselves. So there's a whole parish lookup. That's the starting point, and then if there's a partial parish, you can check out the maps on that link through there. And I think the links have just been posted into the chat, so you can have a play with those while we're talking. But you can take that one away. We could just move on to the next one. So spatial planning. This is going to be a really high level look at the role of spatial planning within a rural context. I think it is fair to say that local planning policy has a huge bearing on local rural housing delivery. So it's not for us to comment either way on local policies around that. That is for the local authority and its members to determine the most appropriate policies for your particular area. But at a high level, at a national level, in terms of the frameworks, really there's two main routes through the planning system for delivering affordable housing in a rural setting. So firstly, the long established concept of rural exception sites, and secondly through section 106 requirements. If we could just move on, please. So rural exception sites, this quote is lifted directly from the National Planning Policy Framework. And I will just work through that. So small sites used for affordable housing in perpetuity, where sites would not normally be used for housing. Rural exception sites seek to address the needs of local community by accommodating households that are either current residents or of an existing family or employment connection. A proportion of market homes may be allowed on the site at the local authority's discretion, for example, to deliver affordable units without grant. So there's some important points to just pick out from this and note. So this is small sites. These are sites that are not allocated through the local plan. So they can be plots that fall outside of the local plan allocations. And there is this explicit link between that land coming forward for affordable housing and current residents or households that have a family connection or an employment connection with the settlement concerned. So this references back to the point I made near the beginning around assessing housing need at a settlement level is very difficult to do at any kind of regional or national level. So to bring forward an exception site, there will need to be this connection, demonstrable connection, between local residents in housing need that have a connection to that settlement to allow that land to come forward for affordable housing. And it brings with it perpetuity arrangements. So again, those protections around right to buy, right to acquire, shared ownership, staircasing out, those kind of protections would hold true on an exception site. Local authorities can, at a local policy level, choose to allow a small amount of market homes on that site, principally to balance the book. So it's a cross subsidy purpose only. It's not about generating profit for the developer or the landowner. It's about bringing forward sufficient crop subsidy from a small number of market sales to enable the scheme to go ahead. If we could just move on. And then section 106. So this again is lifted from the National Planning Policy Framework. So provision of affordable housing should not be sought for residential developments that are not major developments other than in designated rural areas. So major developments, that's 10 units or more. Affordable housing now includes first homes as a brand of affordable housing. But the point around designated rural areas, again, that comes back. So in a designated rural area, not a designated protected area, designated rural area, local policy, and this is the local authority, local authority can bring about policy to set a threshold that is 5 units or even fewer. So the 10 unit threshold that applies through the NPPF can be reduced in designated rural areas where the local authority deems that to be deliverable and appropriate. If we could move on. And then the last part that I'm going to touch on in my section is just to highlight this new form of affordable housing, so first homes. That there's been a separate session on first homes, so this is just to speak about the rural application of the first homes product. If we could just move on. So within the first homes regime, there is the concept that's been introduced now of a first homes exception site. So we just touched on rural exception sites. There is now the option or the ability to bring forward first homes exception sites. So this is lifted from the guidance. A first home exception site is an exception site that delivers primarily first homes as set out in the written ministerial statement. So it can be used as a tool to bring forward land that is outside of local plan allocation, to bring forward homes that have a perpetuity protection arrangement. So first homes, there is an in perpetuity discount from market value that applies not only on first sales but on resales down the line. So first home exception sites can be used to bring forward land for discounted market sale homes, which have that perpetuity arrangement, and could be used in conjunction with a rural exception site. So just want to kind of float really whether that brings about opportunity for some local authorities to think about bringing forward affordable housing of a different flavour in rural areas that maintains that discounted sale aspect in perpetuity. Just to note again that designated rural areas, first homes exception sites cannot be brought forward there. So first home exception sites can't be brought forward in green belt within the Broads Authority or in designated rural areas. If you could just flip to the next slide, please. So there's some potential there. So we've got to kind of layer in the map I showed at the beginning, the purple areas that a large swathe, for example, of Cornwall was designated rural areas, but outside of those designated rural areas, first homes exception sites could be brought forward if you're not in the Norfolk Broads or you're not in one of the other green belt areas that are accepted here. So want to bear in mind, local authorities have got a reasonable degree of discretion locally around policy on this, and that includes consideration locally around the discount rate and what that will be set at in a particular locality in perpetuity. So yeah, want to think about. If we could just move forward. So that is the end of my very high level canter through the background. This really is just to kind of set the scene. We've got a couple of little polls for you just to get a flavour from the audience as to what you see as the barriers towards the barriers to bringing forward. Well, firstly, affordable housing, and then the next poll will be bringing forward housing of all tenures in rural areas. And we'll just let those run for a little while, and then it'll be my pleasure to hand over to Richard, who can put a little more meat on the bone and talk about the work that Midlands Rural Housing does in enabling rural affordable housing to come forward for a range of housing associations across the Midlands. So yeah, the first question then is, what's your top barrier to the supply of rural housing of all tenures, and then supply of affordable housing? And I'm just going to have a little look at the results coming through. So all tenures, we've got land coming out top at the moment. We'll let those run. Do keep your thoughts coming in on that. It'd be really useful feedback to us to get your views. If we could post up the affordable housing poll as well, Katie, that would be great. Thank you. I'll just let those run. So thank you for your time. I hope that was a reasonable introduction to the context and background that ourselves, local authorities, housing associations, and the various rural community councils and the like that work tirelessly to enable affordable housing to come forward in rural areas, the kind of background and context that we're working in. And on that, I will hand over to Richard. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Good morning, everybody. I trust everyone can hear me. My name is Richard Mugglestone. I'm the Managing Director of Midlands Rural Housing. And thanks very much for the invitation today to Homes England to take part in this event. We've heard a lot of the technical detail from John, so I think I've been asked along to talk about the delivery of rural housing and how my organisation works in partnership with local authorities and all other stakeholders to get this done. So if we can skip to the next slide, please. Just a bit of background about who we are. So Midlands Rural Housing are part of EMH Group. They're a large housing association, 20,000 units across the East Midlands, ranging from general needs right through to care and support, with a huge development pipeline of 500 homes as a strategic partner of Homes England. But we're a subsidiary of the group, and we are solely focused on affordable rural housing. And yeah, we exist to promote and enable the right homes in the right places in the villages of the Midlands. Obviously, you're all aware of what, how vital this is. And my slides and presentation will talk about why we have to have this specialist approach, and then give some case studies about how we're getting it done, because the last half an hour of talks and all the questions are talking about the potential barriers, and there are mechanisms out there, but it seems there are a lot of problems that we need to overcome. So hopefully I can illustrate that we are doing it, and with the right partnership approach, we can see some great successes which are making huge differences in our society. So yeah, our work is around rural housing enabling and support services. We predominantly work with 4 rural housing associations, and my slide in a moment will illustrate that. I'm just seeing in the chat that they can't see me on the camera. My camera is on, so I'm trusting that it's working. I'll plough on. Anyway, we do this sort of work with partners through rural housing associations. We closely work with local authorities, be it elected members or officers. We work with housing associations, private developers, land agents, and crucially with parish councils. And we have a role in terms of influencing and lobbying. So we will work with a national level with the Rural Housing Alliance and the National Housing Federation. We work with the Rural Services Network, government agencies, Community Land Trust Network. So a range of partners to make sure we can get these homes delivered. Next slide, please. And specifically my organisation, we're small, just 20 odd staff. But we are, experts in terms of rural housing and getting things delivered and looking after residents and managing the homes when we get these delivered. We work across the East and the West Midlands. Over the last 30 years, we've developed over 1,600 homes, which we now manage through our partner rural housing associations. And we've also enabled hundreds of other homes for other partners, larger housing associations who want to deliver rural housing but don't necessarily have the time or the expertise. So we can work in partnership with others as well to get these done. And currently we're working in over 30 local authorities and over 200 villages across the Midlands in terms of getting more homes built and managing those homes that we've built over the past few decades. Next slide, please. So this will probably be easier when you're able to zoom in on it later on, but this is the sort of model, and it is very unique. It's held up as a model of good practice because, crucially, it allows for relatively small rural housing associations to exist independently. So we've got Peak District Rural Housing Association, which has nearly 300 homes in 50 villages. We've got Northamptonshire Rural Housing Association, who have nearly 600 homes in nearly 50 villages. Warwickshire Rural Housing Association of a similar size, nearly 600 homes in 50 villages, and Leicestershire, who is the newest of the bunch, who have just less than 200 homes in just less than 20 villages. But they are all independent of each other, but they buy their services in from Midlands Rural Housing. So if we're going out to Northamptonshire to talk about development, we'll be delivering the business plan of Northamptonshire Rural. If we're talking about housing management in Warwickshire, we'll be representing Warwickshire Rural Housing Association. So all the services that you see across the bottom of the screen in terms of development services, getting the homes built, managing the homes, housing management, looking after our residents, we do that representing whichever association we're working in that geographical zone for that day. We've got customer care services, so resident support, maintenance services, looking after asset management and the day-to-day repairs and voids. We've got governance work that we do with each of those individual associations to make sure they have the right policies, strategies in place to deliver rural housing and be well-governed organisations. But we also work with other organisations on a consultancy basis. So whilst the majority of our work is spent delivering the business plans of these 4 rural housing associations, we can work on a consultancy basis for larger associations who may have land in rural areas or groups of local authorities who want to generate a pipeline of affordable housing needs surveys. So our expertise can be spread far and wide. But the model really is based around allowing these 4 housing associations across the Midlands to have local representation, to have individual boards who set the strategy and set the business plans for their associations, and it's down to us to deliver it. And it's a real success story. Over the last 30 years, as I say, for some of these associations, we've been able to deliver, manage and maintain the homes, and obviously doing vital work with that local accountability, which when you go out and speak in parish council meetings or to local communities, is what they want to hear. They don't necessarily always want to hear from larger associations. They want locally accountable organisations, and that's how we work through these rural housing associations. So yeah, it's a good model, and one that is still growing from strength to strength. I think we've got development pipelines of nearly 200 homes in the next few years across the 4 associations. So yeah, a real success story, and we're making the best use of the mechanisms that we've had outlined already today. Next slide, please. So why do we need to have an organisation like ours? Why do we need to work differently in rural areas? Well, from a development point of view, we're not like much of the affordable housing. We're not market reliant. We do buy some Section 106 units, but that's quite rare. Usually we will start from scratch. So that relies on good local authority relations, an understanding of the local politics, great relations with councillors and officers. We adopt a community and needs-led approach. So we will always work with the local community, the parish council, and all of our schemes will be based on an identified local need. We are committed to local consultation, and we're aware that there is ongoing scrutiny, which I'll touch on later on, around our work, be it the homes we build or the homes we manage. And we don't shy away from the consultations aspects of that. And yeah, we're committed to making sure that all the strategies and policies at local and national level are rural proofed. So there aren't any unintended consequences that would stop us developing more homes. Next slide, please. And yeah, the mechanisms are there, as we've already seen. The majority of what we do is through rural exception site delivery, but we do buy some Section 106 units if they're of the right space standards and the right build quality. Recently, we've been venturing into a cross-subsidy model where local market homes are for sale and are able to cross-subsidise the affordable element. We work with community land trusts and community-led development, and in some cases, we've converted existing buildings. So every village is different, every community is different, and there are a range of opportunities to deliver. And I've got some case studies in a moment to illustrate how we do that. Next slide, please. So this is the partnership route, I suppose. It's supposed to be a simple wheel, get a sort of a clock face going from starting at 1 o'clock, where we partner with district and local authority partners to talk about where housing needs surveys need to take place. We will then go to a parish council, explain to them what affordable housing is, why we need to do a housing needs survey, get their support for that. When they're bought into it, we'll carry out a survey in a village that will help us to understand the housing needs of local people. And that's the crucial part of sort of building and building the knowledge around affordable housing with parish councils and with the wider community, and then allowing them to use that information to influence and inform any plans that are taking place. It might be a neighbourhood development plan, it might be housing policy that's taking place or being reviewed at the time, or any strategic plans that are happening locally. The evidence that we can produce from housing needs surveys will help to inform that. We then share the findings with the local community. We'll go back and say, we found a need in this village for affordable homes for local people, but what do you want to do about it? They may use that evidence to help influence building that's already planned, so it tries to meet the identified local need. But in most cases, we will be asked to introduce, housing delivery partners, which may be the rural housing associations we work with. It may be other providers, housing associations who have a commitment to local needs housing, and then we'll stay involved. We'll work with the community, the parish council, the local authority, and the housing association, who is a strategic partner of Homes England, to help look for sites, to help look for sort of partnership funding approach. And we're committed, as we say, to going back and consulting the community at every stage. So if we found sites, we'll speak to the community about what they think about those sites. We'll talk to them about design of the homes. We'll talk to them about the layouts. We'll talk to them about the energy efficiency of the homes. So, it really is a whole community partnership approach. And all of that has to take place before we get through into the planning process and achieve the planning permissions to then start on site. So almost sounds fairly simple when you put it on a slide like that, but there's a reason I've got grey hair like this, and these things do take many years. So it's tried and tested, it works, but every village is different, as I've said before. So we need to take the community along and involve partners to make it a success. Next slide, please. And yeah, I just wanted to put one in about housing management, because the work doesn't stop when we build the homes. Obviously, we manage on behalf of our partner housing associations as well, and the housing management is actually as crucial as what the homes look like. We have this sort of labour-intensive allocations process, because we've committed to a community and said these are going to be homes for local people when we're building a rural exception site. So we need to make sure that we're adhering to the local lettings plan, the Section 106 local needs criteria and local connection criteria. So there's a lot of liaison with the local authority over the nominations, and there's a huge amount of community scrutiny. They want to know. Obviously, we can't sort of talk to them about nominations and allocations, but they will make sure that the homes are for local people. They'll make sure the homes are well managed, as we said we would do, and they want to make sure that we're looking after the residents in our homes. Quite rightly, these are local people. They are people in the community who are working there, or our family there. So we need to be doing the right thing and looking after and supporting residents. So yeah, the scrutiny remains long after the build process is finished. But our proactive and sensitive housing management approach is the main reason that we get invited back. Our reputation is at stake with every scheme we build, and then long after that with our continued management of schemes. So something that often gets overlooked, but I just thought I'd flag it up today, because the scrutiny remains for a long time after. Next slide, please. So into the case studies, and I start with a simple exception site, if there is such a thing. But this is an example that came forward in Leicestershire, in the district of Blaby, the village of Croft, where we were asked to do a number of housing needs surveys on behalf of a local partnership, which I'll talk about shortly. Croft was one of the villages that we went to the parish council and carried out a survey, which the parish council fully supported. We found a need for 10 homes for local people. And again, once the village were consulted and they were involved along with the parish council searching for sites, exception sites were explained to them. So we walked around the village looking for suitable sites, found one next to the school, and then went about involving delivery partners. EMH Homes, in this case, were the delivery partner that put together the plans for 10 homes. The community consulted on the plans. And then a sort of fairly innovative funding package was put together, which involved the district council, the housing association, the county council, as well as Homes England grant. So a real partnership effort to get the viability right for these for this scheme. And again, it was carefully allocated through Leicestershire Rural Housing Association to make sure that local people were housed. So that was a fairly standard exception site, but a success story when we gained some real momentum in Leicestershire a number of years ago. And on the next slide, please, you can see that we were invited back. As I said, our reputation is at stake, and often it's a case of building trust. And clearly, we did what we said we would do there. And a number of years later, the parish council contacted the local authority and said, we liked what we got, but those 10 homes aren't enough. There is a growing need. Once people see that homes are being built, they realise, actually, I could qualify for one of these. I'd like to, get my chance, but there aren't enough, vacancies. So we were asked to go back and do the process again. The community and parish council fully understood the survey, did that work, again engaged everybody on the site finding, and actually an extension of the original exception site was a possibility. So we consulted the community, drew up some rough plans, and they said yes, they like the idea of extending by 6 homes to make it a 16 home scheme in total, but they were concerned that this would carry on and on and on. And so we said, okay, fine. We listened to what they said, designed out any possibility of it being extended again, made a nice cul-de-sac, and the community said, thank you. You've listened, you've done what we've asked, and designed out any possibility of this being extended again. And through their weight, fully behind it, unanimous planning application. Again, the same partnership funding, Homes England, EMH Homes, the Housing Association putting their money into it, as well as the district council, and even the county council in this case. So again, partnership working to make it viable, partnership working to push it forwards, and the community fully behind the scheme. So which was again allocated by Leicestershire Rural to people with that close connection. So just a traditional exception site case study success. Next slide, please. And this is the sort of next step from exception sites. This is Northamptonshire Rural Housing Association, where we've had success with a scheme there in Nassington, firstly in 1994, and then again in 2006. So these things take time, and we don't rush to sort of try and build more homes. But when the community come back and say we think it's time for more, we'll happily work with them, as long as the local authority are happy. The landowner's really on board here, and we're just on site completing the third phase of this exception site. And this one is a cross-subsidy scheme. So there are 9 affordable homes, and then a small number of market homes, which have been made possible through new policies, where the local developer has been very sort of open with their open book accounting, and it allows everybody to see and say, well, actually, yes, we need to take some of the profit from that market housing to help cross-subsidise the affordable housing. The sale of the market homes are marketed locally for the first 3 months as well. So where these happen, we often see that they get snapped up by local people off plan, and you're really creating a completely mixed community. We've got some rented, some shared ownership, and some local market homes, which are really meeting the needs of local people. So a great new approach on cross subsidy. Next slide, please. And this cross-subsidy model is happening across the East and the West Midlands. It's a model that is attractive to landowners, but they don't get an uplift in the cost of land, but they may be able to sell a little bit more land because the developments might be slightly larger. It's not a replacement for grant funding. I think I probably should say on a Homes England event, we still need grant funding, but this allows it to go further, obviously. It's a great, again, partnership approach to funding, and it's really attractive to small developers. We try to work with small developers where we can, and the small house builders really like this model because they're small scale, but they have a sort of guaranteed income from the properties that they're going to sell to a housing association, who then own those. It gives them a guaranteed cash flow. So in sort of challenging times like this, it's actually a really attractive approach to small developers to get involved with. Next slide, please. And then the next few slides are just to show, we've done the traditional exception site, we've got the newer version of the cross-subsidy model, and we can actually build in the Peak District as well. We can build in the National Park, and if you can do it here, then I firmly believe you can do it anywhere. Peak District Rural Housing Association, for the last few decades, have built nearly 300 homes in the Peak District, be it like the examples there, converting an old school building, be it a community land trust, be it literally 2-3 homes on the edge of a village. It's labour intensive, it's hard work, but it's so rewarding. And obviously with the pressures on second homes and the economy in areas like national parks, it's very difficult to get things built. But I think the rewards for building in areas like this are welcomed by the community probably more than anywhere else. Next slide, please. Just another example of the fantastic designs, again, very community led, very much involving the community in terms of what they want to see, the type of stone used, and some of the views from these properties are just outstanding. It was probably some of our proudest work happens in the Peak District, and like I say, if we can do it there, then we can do it anywhere. Next slide, please. And yeah, it doesn't have to just be normal housing. It can be really modern, really energy efficient homes. So the final case study on actual schemes was one from Warwickshire Rural Housing Association, where they worked in the village of Wootton Wubbin and managed to develop the first rural affordable housing scheme, which reached passive house standards in that region. And the next few slides will canter through that. So next one, please. We were invited as Warwickshire Rural Housing Association to speak to the village about solutions around affordable housing. The Rural Housing Neighbourhood had done some work on housing need. Councillors were keen, and they had a neighbourhood plan group in place at the time, and the local authority were also keen to get something off the ground. So we sort of took the lead, involved the community on what they wanted to see. Next slide, please. The parish plan told us that 3/4 of the village wanted any development in the village to embody energy efficiency. The Rural Housing Enablers Survey said that there needed to be a huge amount of housing for elderly people in the village. So half the scheme were planned to be bungalows. Next slide. The community didn't have gas, and they were wanting to avoid expensive electrical heating, so they told us through the neighbourhood plan and the parish council. And one of the corporate objectives of Stratford District Council was to reduce carbon and alleviate fuel poverty. So a lot of things to throw into the mix. Next slide, please. But we managed to engage a local landowner on the preferred site following consultation with the community. He understood the limitations of land values in a greenbelt area, and we managed to overcome traffic problems, access problems, and also the orientation of the site to make sure we got the right solar gain into the passive houses to help with heat. And then, the planning application was passed unanimously. Next slide, please. And we ended up with an award-winning scheme, a national award for best green scheme, and also a royal opening. The Princess Royal came along to take a look at the scheme and do the official opening. But the main thing for me is, since the homes have been built, the resident satisfaction has been huge in terms of energy bills, temperature, low noise, and the sort of comfortable living environment, and the health benefits as well. So it's a huge thing going forwards, and hopefully just a bit of an example of the fact that we can build energy efficient homes, which are going to be crucial going forwards with the cost of living crisis and the road towards net zero. So again, this can be done in rural areas as well. It will take, again, partnership funding to get these things there, but certainly these things are possible. Next slide, please. So away from the Rural Housing Association route, we work with other partners, as we said, and a great example of a local partnership. We saw one of the exception sites that came out of this partnership earlier on with the exception site scheme. But we have a project in Leicestershire which involves all the rurally based local authorities, as well as the county council, and 3 larger housing associations who are committed to affordable rural housing, but don't necessarily have the time to get engaged and the level that we need to. So they fund a programme of work between them, which we carry out, which means we have to go and engage parish councils, carry out housing needs surveys to find out what the needs of local people are. We need to sort of win the hearts and minds and do the explanation around affordable rural housing and community engagement, and then do the site finding as well. So a lot of work, which local authorities don't necessarily have the time to do, and larger housing associations don't have the time to do. So we've got a number of these local partnerships across the Midlands, which help bring forward opportunities to get more homes built. So happy to speak to anybody about opportunities like that in their area if they're close to the Midlands. Next slide, please. Yeah, so in summary, all of the work is based around community engagement, ongoing consultation, but crucially, strong partnerships, be it housing associations, Homes England, local authorities and parish councils, as well as elected members. It's a partnership approach to get this done. The rural housing associations that we manage have got a proven track record over, like I say, 30 years in some cases, and have that long-term interest in communities, which communities really, really value and trust. Next slide, please. And it is a shared success story. As I say, it's not us. We might take the lead in some aspects, but we need everybody's expertise. It's councillors, it's officers, parish councils, communities. We need a partnership approach on site finding, on funding, on looking for new mechanisms. And to me, local authorities are right in the centre of this. So I'm so pleased to see so many people here today looking to enhance knowledge and ask the right questions to push this even more. Next slide, please. And our job, and we'll continue to do this, is to promote what affordable housing really looks like, because one of the big problems is that people don't understand it. They don't think they'll qualify for it. They think that housing needs of local people will be met through the market or a few Section 106 units, and really that doesn't meet the needs of local people. So we're out there telling them, these are what the homes look like. This is who's going to live there. This is how we can do it. This is what will help you through this process. So it's telling people about what they look like. Next slide, please. It's telling people it's more than homes. It's delivering innovation in terms of energy efficiency, benefits to the community, safe, warm, residents with security, and we do so much more than housing, be it work with schools. I think we've got pictures there of playgrounds, of community orchards, of allotments. It goes so much more, so much further than housing, and that again is crucial in rural areas. Next slide, please. And again, for our residents, it's about energy efficiency, it's about scheme visits, it's about keeping in touch with residents, bursary schemes. It's looking after the people that have that long-term interest in our homes, and the people that we are there to look after, who in turn, and as we've seen more in the last 2 years than ever before, have huge benefits to their local community. So I think we're getting there with the messages, but any chance we get, we'll go out there and educate people in terms of what we do, what affordable housing means, and how we can deliver it. Next slide. The challenges will be touched on later on by English Rural Housing Association after lunch, but I thought I'd put it there as a bit of a teaser to say, you know, that there are many challenges. The questions, obviously, that are coming up show that the challenges we face. A lack of understanding, as I just said, is probably one of the biggest. When you go out there and speak at meetings and meet the public, there is a massive misunderstanding about what we do. We need to be able to differentiate ourselves from general market and normal house building. We need to make sure that strategies are rural proofed. There aren't any sort of unintended consequences of things like voluntary right to buy or first homes. We need to make sure we retain as many delivery mechanisms as possible and keep adding to them. Land will always be a problem. We must work and maintain this specialist approach. So it's great that we've been able to have this opportunity today, so we can, you know, give affordable rural housing the specialist approach that it very much needs. Next slide. I think that probably is everything from me. So I'm due now to hand back to Victoria to take us through the question and answers.
Fantastic. Thank you, Richard. That was wonderful. So we have Q&A now, and we have John joining us and also Richard. But I'm delighted to say that this afternoon's speakers, Matt and Alison, can also join us, which is great. So we've got lots of your questions, and together the panel, I'm sure, will answer as many as possible. So we've got Matt and Alison joining us, and John. Fantastic. So let's start off with a question I'd like to put to Matt, and it's just come in. It's one of the last questions in the chat you'll see there, and it asks, does Homes England recognise the higher unit costs of small rural schemes? And this is something that we're often asked in lots of different settings around recognition of higher costs, whether it's geographical issues or for specialist housing. I wonder, Matt, if you'd like to respond to that.
Oh yeah, so I did just pop something underneath the question itself, but and I am going to mention it this afternoon, so a little teaser for this afternoon. But when we're looking at schemes and how we appraise them, we do look on a scheme by scheme basis. We benchmark against similar types of schemes, and yeah, we do recognise that depending on the different types of scheme, whether it be a particular remote rural site or a site with difficult access issues or various types of abnormals, we will look at that in our appraisal of the value for money criteria around whether we accept or not on a bid. And we certainly would say, please do come and talk to our growth teams about your schemes. We want to hear about the schemes, and we want to try and find ways to allocate funding where we can. So yeah, there's a recognition that there's all types of different schemes that are developed by us. So that's the kind of answer to that one, I think. But I will mention it this afternoon as well. And there was a question just above that, Victoria. Can I just answer that as well?
Yeah, absolutely.
A question that was about an accepted model to get Homes England to agree to a mixed funding model. Again, we need to look at each scheme individually. So I wouldn't say there was a model as such that one thing is this and one thing is that, but we'll look at each scheme individually and work through that.
Thank you. Brilliant. That's great. Well, you're making my job much easier by pulling questions out. That's fantastic. Thank you. Right. So I'm going to ask Richard if he can come in here. So we've got two questions here that are linked to your presentation and your work, your day-to-day work. A lot of questions and interest in the community engagement work that you alluded to. And the first question asks, does the community, can you give more detail into how the community got involved in the design work? And you did touch on that, but if you could perhaps give us some more insights and some of your thoughts on community engagement and particular challenges, opportunities within rural areas and working with a rural community.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's something that we are committed to. I say we'll explain about affordable housing at the outset, but then once there is a bit more to look at, when there's an established need, we can then consult and we'll hire the village hall, invite the community down to talk about potential sites and what they'd like homes to look like. You've got to get the community on board. You've got to get them bought into things. Again, it's managing expectations, because these schemes can be expensive, and materials obviously are getting more and more expensive by the day. But we need to listen to communities. We don't want to put something there that is going to be an eyesore, or they're going to push back against, because we see where it works well. Neighbouring villages want us to go and work there as well, and it helps to spread the good work and around affordable housing. So we'll have events in village halls. We can do things online now where we'll ask people to feed into what they'd like to see in terms of design, right down to sort of heating systems, and what's important to them. But yeah, we have to manage expectations through that process, but it's certainly something we're committed to.
Fantastic, thank you. I'll stay with you, Richard, again on your the work that you do. Do you outsource your local housing needs survey? And if so, can you share your experiences?
In terms of, we carry out housing needs surveys for anyone that wants them doing. There are rural housing enablers out there who carry out housing needs surveys as well. But literally, we will carry out those surveys where they're required. So if it's a private developer, if it's a housing association, and they want to understand the needs of a community to help inform a planning application, or try and unlock a site, then we can get involved and work with the local authority to make sure that the survey follows best practice, and will engage the community to get good results and good buy-in.
Fantastic, thank you. Right, I'm going to move to Alison. You're going to be speaking this afternoon, but it'd be great to get your thoughts and experiences on the following question. And I guess we could also see if any other panel members have something to say on this. Have you heard of lenders not keen on lending to RPs for mortgages where staircasing is restricted to 80%? Alison, would you like to go first with this one, and then we could perhaps come back to Richard as well?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Victoria. Yes, I know that many RPs raise this as a concern and an issue on restricted staircasing leases. I think from English Rural's perspective, we only, all of our shared ownership properties are on 80% restricted staircasing leases. So we have to make it work. And there are lenders. Okay, there isn't a wide range of lenders, but there are 3 or 4 key and 1 or 2 regional lenders that will lend on 80% restricted staircasing leases, and we have an active resale program as well. And I think it is a reduced number of lenders, and we're always looking, and Homes England, I know, also look on our behalf to add more lenders to this list. So it isn't impossible, and say we've never not sold a shared ownership property, be it a new one or a relet. It just does take, fostering those relationships with lenders, and through your own track record, showing them that it isn't the risk that they maybe perceive that it is.
Fantastic. Does anyone else like to come in there with their experiences? Would you agree with what Alison's saying there?
Yeah, I'd agree completely. The number of lenders is limited, but again, it's about explanation to the lender and forging those relationships, and then signposting our potential shared ownership residents to go and work with those lenders. So yeah, it's limited, and it's harder work, but the market is still out there.
Brilliant, fantastic, wonderful. Thanks both. I have a question now for John. So John, you mentioned a number of good examples of SPDs in your presentation. There were a few questions there wanting to know more. I know you put some points in the chat, but it would be good to get your thoughts on that. So there was the first question was, can you let us know the good examples of SPDs? And then there was another question, helpful to know LA SPDs that assist affordable housing in rural areas. Over to you, John.
Yeah, so this is going to be a risky answer because I'm going to highlight Cornwall as a particularly good example, but the risk is that there is other good examples out there, and people will feel hard done to that they don't get a mention this morning. So apologies for that if that's the case. But I am going to talk about Cornwall's housing SPD. So it's not a rural SPD. It's not an affordable housing SPD. It's a housing SPD, but it's comprehensive. And when we're thinking about rural affordable housing in Cornwall, it really sets out very clearly the expectations that the council is demanding of developers, of landowners, of RPs that are operating in the county, bringing forward housing. So it goes into quite a bit of detail. It specifies, methodologies around defining local need, building on the point from a question or two ago around, or cropped up in the chat around housing need survey. So the methodology is set out and the expectations around that. An approach around clustering parishes is around service provision and getting housing development where services can still be accessed in a meaningful way at a local geography without automatically excluding settlements from affordable housing development. There's guidance around design, mix, and accessibility, and those kind of questions which we'd expect anyway. But then it does also think about viability assessments. How the local authority will consider scheme viability, and that relates to the question that's cropped up around cross subsidy from market units on sites as well. So it's kind of all been thought about in the round and put out in a publicly available document. I think the link has gone into the chat earlier for all to see, so that the ground rules are set in Cornwall. Everybody knows the game that they're playing and what the expectations are and the standards that need to be met. So one example of several that are good out there, but a particularly good one that highlight for this morning in this area.
Fantastic, thank you. Right, I have a question for all of you. So I'll ask the question and then we'll start with Alison, then Richard, and then see if our Homes England colleagues have anything to add. And this question is very wide, but it'd be fantastic to get your thoughts. Is the implementation of rural housing not even scratching the surface to the problem, and therefore the system is nowhere near big enough to in scope, nor fit for purpose? So Alison, would you like to start off with that? It's a huge one. Your reflections on the system, the approach, the challenges, and is it fit for purpose, our approach and ways of working?
Yeah, that is a difficult question, but an interesting one. Yes, I think the system is fit for purpose. It's challenging rural housing. I mean, I've been in this sort of rural housing world for nearly 30 years, and the rural exceptions policy is a good one. And I've been pleased recently to see that by moving forward and introducing that level of cross subsidy, that has actually released some sites. So I think we need to be continually reviewing what we're offering, and is there some innovative way, is there something else that we can do? And it needs the partnership of the government, Homes England, and local authorities. We're all working towards delivering more affordable housing. We all know how good it is for rural communities. We know the benefits. There's a lot of research out there confirming that. So I think we have to just keep plugging on. We have to keep moving forward. And, every year it gets a bit more difficult, but there is, it is out there. And I think working together, we can achieve it. Maybe a bit of a about that, but
thank you. Yeah, it's a rallying call. Brilliant, thank you. And Richard, do you have anything to add then?
Yeah, just struggling to come off mute. Yeah, it's a great question. It is fit for purpose, but it just needs scaling up. I think in the many years that I've done this job, there are so many reports that come out. I'll probably go back to one from 15 years ago. The Affordable Rural Housing Commission said, to meet the housing needs of local people, you need to build probably half a dozen homes, I think it is, in every village every year. And obviously we're not scratching the surface of that. We've got fantastic support from Homes England and all the partners I've talked about earlier, but it needs resourcing from every level, all partners, be that housing associations, local authority resources in terms of planners and funding, and yeah, government needs to put more funding in as well. But we're doing what we can. Yeah, I do take the point, it is only scratching the surface. But we shouldn't belittle that, because every scheme we build makes a huge difference. And we've seen, as I say, in the last 2 years, the effect that a small scheme of rural housing can have in a village has really helped keep communities together. Every scheme is a good practice example and has a good news story behind it every year. So let's not beat ourselves up too much. We're doing what we can with what we have. But we are certainly ready to scale up if the resources are put into every part of the partnership.
Fantastic, thank you. Right, well, looking at the time, we did say we'd finish at 12:30, so I will draw the Q&A to a close. Thank you so much to Richard, Alison, Matt and John. That was fantastic. And thank you to Richard and John for presenting this morning. I'll just tell you, everybody, what we're planning to do now. So what we're going to do is have a break. You'll have time for lunch. You can answer any of those emails that you need to. Stay in the chat. So stay on the call. Don't leave us, but just make sure that you mute and turn your cameras off. So just enough time, as I said, for some food and to answer a few emails. And then we'll start again at 2 o'clock prompt. And we'll hear from Matt Dodd of Homes England talking about our rural strategy. And then we'll hear from Alison Thompson from English Rural Housing Association about their experiences, in particular development challenges and opportunities. Welcome back to the Winter Learning Programme session on unlocking rural housing. I'm going to hand over to Matt Dodd from Homes England. Thank you.
Hi everyone, and thanks so much for coming. Just to introduce me, for those who don't know me, I work in the Affordable Housing Strategy team here at Homes England, and I've worked here for a little while on various issues, but in particular on rural housing and community-led housing, which I've always had an interest in, and I'm sure I will have worked with many of you over the years. Can we just have the next slide, please? So today, what we're going to cover this afternoon, after a really fascinating session this morning, which hopefully most of you are able to join, we're going to talk a little bit about Homes England's work in rural areas, and about the strategy that we've been developing over the last few months. We're going to look at the sort of barriers that Homes England has identified and how we might work to overcome those barriers, and then we're going to hear from Alison from English Rural Housing Association about the work that they do and how they work to overcome some of these barriers. And then at the end, I'm sure there will be time for some questions and discussion. And just before I start, I just want to say it's a really good opportunity to talk to lots of people, and I hope that we can sort of continue the discussion about rural housing after this session, by getting in touch with Homes England through your local delivery managers, but also through me in the rural housing, in the Affordable Housing Strategy team, so that we can continue and sort of build on this sort of contact that we've now made. So can we go to the next slide, please? And the next one. So what do Homes England do in rural areas? Well, we have worked and been committed to working in rural areas for some time now. As you can see on this slide, over the last 10 sort of years, over 27,000 affordable homes have been delivered in rural areas. As was mentioned this morning, for our purposes here, we're talking about settlements with a population of fewer than 3,000. And our affordable homes programme has been one of the primary routes to that delivery. So in the new affordable homes programme that runs from 2021 to 26, there's an expectation that 10% of the homes delivered through that will be rural homes. And with the size of the programme increasing, that means around 12 to 13,000 homes in rural areas should be delivered. Now, the way the Affordable Homes Programme works, as I'm sure many of you will know, is through two main routes: through our strategic partners, who are our large housing associations and developers, who will deliver with a sort of a programme of delivery throughout lots of different parts of the country, and then through continuous market engagement, which is the way that the route that we've taken previously, where individual schemes come to us. So to do this, to get anywhere near our 10% target, we need a wide variety of delivery partners, and we work with large housing associations, we work with our strategic partners, our medium-sized RPs, and also our smaller, more specialist providers, which we'll hear from later on today. We also look to work with community-led organisations, and I'll talk a little bit about diversifying our delivery routes later on. Local authorities are key to help us deliver these, deliver this target through the Affordable Homes Programme, and so that's why we're really glad you're here today, listening to us. And the types of sites that we deliver with our partners in rural areas can range from all sorts of sizes, the smaller rural exceptional sites to much larger Section 106 sites. And geographically, recently we've seen quite a skew towards the south of the country in our delivery. We want to make sure that as we work through the 21-26 programme, we're working in all parts of the country that need rural affordable housing. So that's something to think about as we work through this afternoon. So the graph on the right shows the delivery in the 10 years. As you'll see, a predominance of affordable rent in rural completions over the last few years, social rent now coming into the picture, and as government policies change and promote different tenures, you'll see low cost home ownership coming in as well. You'll see this sort of roller coaster pattern usually towards the end of programs, but 2021 was an odd year, as I'm sure you'll understand, with COVID. The proportion of homes delivered across those periods has remained between the sort of 8.5% and 12.5% of the overall programme. So last year, although there was a drop off, it was still around 12% of the total completion. So we keep that proportion about right, even if the numbers change slightly. But yeah, I think a takeaway figure from that is around 27,000 affordable homes in the last 10 years. Okay, could we have the next slide, please? So I just wanted to touch on a couple of other elements of Homes England's work that has helped deliver homes in rural areas. So this scheme is a scheme in Devon, Rowborough Community Property Trust, a community land trust, who worked to become a registered provider themselves and delivered 4 affordable rented homes, and also worked to deliver market homes on different parts of the site, and took funding from our Home Building Fund, which is a loan fund that does work in rural areas. So the contractor who worked with the Community Land Trust, Mazards, received a loan from us to develop out parts of the scheme around the village, which unlocked the other funding. And we want to see this sort of approach to different types of funding come into play on more and more schemes where we can. We want to encourage Homes England's interventions to be possible across our programmes, not just Affordable Homes Programme. Could you just move on to the next slide, please? And this is another example of where our funds away from our Affordable Homes Programme, or our work away from our Affordable Homes Programme, has helped to deliver, or is helping to deliver, a scheme. It's not done yet, in a village in East Devon. So this was a site, an old disused factory site, in a rural market town, although it's a very small market town. It's only just larger than a sort of a village. The site was acquired, and demolition of the existing buildings took place. And there is, as you can see on the picture, the artist's impression, development of up to 72 new homes, so different tenures. Only 20% of these will be affordable, but there'll be different tenures in there. There's also industrial units and large public open space. And alongside that, we've worked with a community land trust in that village to look at where they might work on other sites. So we've taken a sort of a whole place approach there to support development in that already thriving rural settlement. So our land funds, although not traditionally seen as working in rural areas so much, can have an impact in certain places, and this is an example of where they can, and we look forward to seeing how that one progresses. So as part of our work to develop a rural strategy for Homes England, we have looked at what barriers we might be able to have an impact on. So initially, I think when we were looking at barriers, we were trying to change the whole world, but then we decided to be a little bit more circumspect and look at what Homes England could actually have an impact on. And the way we do this and the way we've looked at it is by working with colleagues across the agency. We have an internal rural working group with people from all different parts of the agency, so affordable housing, our markets partners places team, our loan teams, our investment teams, to look at the work going on in rural areas. And they have provided absolutely vital intelligence as we've developed this strategy. So what we did was we thought we would theme the barriers that we identified into three main areas. So land and planning, how we get sites and what we do when we've got them; investment, how we can invest and pay for development; and skills and capacity, where we might be able to help in the delivery of rural housing by increasing skills and capacity. So next slide, please. The sorts of things we identified within each of those categories then guided what work we would do on them. So on land availability, it's clear that incentivizing landowners is one of the key areas that can be quite difficult to achieve. So how can we help incentivize landowners? Rural exception sites linked to incentivizing those landowners, but with plot values low, how can we help landowners bring those forward without hanging on to sites in the hope of achieving other planning permissions? And again, that's linked to things like first homes and other policy developments that may increase land values. How can we make sure that those opportunities don't just increase land values, but actually increase opportunities for more delivery in rural areas? So I think John mentioned constraints earlier, and we recognise there are lots of different constraints in rural areas, as well as things like SSSIs, national parks, AONBs. We've got to look at how we can look at the various design constraints. Local vernacular, as I'm sure you're all aware, can provide sometimes difficult planning decisions. In areas such as national parks, there is a multi-layered local government, and the very sort of geographic nature of rural sites. They can be remote, they can be difficult to access. So perhaps some of those developments, such as MMC, can be more difficult to apply, and environmental standards more difficult to meet. And then something that I think everyone is aware of, local objections and what's known as NIMBYism. I think a few years ago, from my experience, although you might have a different view, it was starting to get a little bit better. But it seems to have gone slightly in the other way at the moment, and objections seem to be more widespread. There seems to be a divergence between people perhaps who have lived in a settlement for all their life as to people coming into settlements. And I think we see there's a risk of that becoming more pronounced post-COVID, with evidence of more people moving into rural areas. Will that exacerbate the problem? But we do see that there's an understanding of the need for affordable housing. So hopefully we can work together to overcome some of those, and we'll talk about that again in a minute. Can we move to the next slide, please? So investment. So we recognise that it can be difficult to achieve economies of scale on those small sites. I've just talked about access difficulties. That is also linked to infrastructure requirements. Materials to be able to meet local vernacular requirements can be expensive, can be more difficult to source. Materials in general are more expensive at the moment. So we're seeing that. So will that play out more where we're looking at those more expensive materials? And then with the drive towards net zero, how will that impact on rural areas? Will that make a more significant impact on cost than it would in other areas? Or will we be able to offset that more easily? Within those net zero considerations are things like the requirement for 10% biodiversity gain. How do we meet that in a greenfield site? There's lots of considerations there. The development risk with rural areas, when things can take a long time to deliver, as I'm sure you're all aware, that can lead to a lack of certainty and abortive costs having to go into rural schemes. Is that more of a problem than in other schemes? I think it may well be. And can that lead to a slightly lower risk appetite across some associations and some providers? And sort of linked to that again is then access to mortgages and development finance. There was some discussion around that in the chat, specifically linked to designated protected areas, and we definitely recognise that where there are restrictions layered onto rural schemes, that can be difficult in lending. And for other reasons, particularly when we see community-led organisations perhaps looking to develop, and we see community-led developing in some of our more remote sites, they can find it really difficult to access lending because they don't have that track record. And I think that sometimes is the case with smaller associations too. So can Homes England help here? Next slide, please. Skills and capacity. When we were looking into these, we found there's some real sort of, it was something that came up over and over again in our discussions with people around difficulty in getting contractors, sourcing those contractors, difficulty in persuading registered providers to work in some areas. Certainly, sometimes it's seen as some of our larger providers, it was harder to get them to work on rural schemes, but not just our large strategic partners, others too. Was there the capacity within some of our smaller, more specialist providers to do that development? Often the smaller providers were relying on large providers to provide it, and that might not be around or as readily available as it once was. And there can be particularly specific and niche skills to develop those remote, difficult to access sites. Linked again, capacity in local authorities to have the resource to work on the small rural schemes. Difficult planning teams. Planning teams are under pressure, dealing with difficult and potential complications. So where can we help on that? One way of helping that I think in some areas works well is rural housing enablers, but support and funding for rural housing enablers can be a bit precarious. I think a lot of people agree that rural housing enablers provide a really key service, finding sites, establishing the need. There was talk of needs surveys earlier, and trying to explain the intricacies of affordable housing development to communities, but doing it in a way that is almost a little bit independent from a housing association or a local authority coming in and talking about housing. So they could be a key way of increasing delivery. And finally, looking at data and evidence in Homes England, but across others as well, not just Homes England, and we found that it was quite difficult to get the data and evidence that we needed to fully develop the strategy. And so we've done some work on that, which I'll talk about later, which I think is really builds a really rich picture of what's going on in the rural development sector. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So then we looked at all of those and we thought about what Homes England as an agency might be able to do and what we might be able to do with our partners and work with our partners on. So can we move to the next slide? So some of the things that we've already done, and what I would say is on these, these don't work for everything, but they are looking at what Homes England can and can't do and where we might be able to help out. So on land availability, we own lots of land at Homes England. We have our land hub that people can access to look at the land that we have. But it was always quite tricky with the way things like Delivery Partner Panel had previously worked to be able to access those sites. So we launched something different called the dynamic purchasing system, which is a new way of doing that, new way of accessing a new way of accessing like the framework to be able to access those sites. So the dynamic purchasing system allows you to access at any time and for a specific site, for example, whereas before you had to join the framework. It also allows access for smaller sites. We're still not talking tiny here, but it is a lot more flexible. And we are engaged in talking to the team that run the dynamic purchasing system about how we can sort of expand that more and encourage more work in rural areas. We're also wondering about how we can start to help on site identification. Parts of our team work to develop a sort of a single pipeline of opportunities across different local authority areas. So how can we use that to help find small sites? And if we've got that broader knowledge, can we then start looking at how we might be able to package sites together for larger associations, perhaps who'd be more willing to take on a package of sites? We don't know yet whether that will work, but it's something that we're definitely looking at. So we also wanted to look at how we could work together on sort of more consistent approaches to delivery. And this was something that came up earlier in one of the questions around rural exception sites. So we're always looking when I think one of the questions was around models for cross-subsidy. So this is a fine balance we find. Whenever we try and apply too much consistency, we don't want to make miss out on too many opportunities by being flexible, which is why we do look at it in a scheme by scheme way. But what we're trying to do is look and make sure that that's applied consistently. So we're going to continue that work agency wide and make sure people understand the opportunities that rural exception site delivery can provide. So the consistency is around that understanding, so that when we're looking on a scheme by scheme basis, we're all coming from the same starting point. And I think that's really important on those kind of slightly tricky decisions that need to be made around things like cross subsidy. And undoubtedly, cross subsidy has provided the opportunity for sites to come forward. So we want to make sure that we can respond to that in a sensible way. Similarly, on those brokering and direct relationships with different local government areas, how can we better relate directly with national parks, and how can we think about different positive planning initiatives? So, for example, neighbourhood plans. There's been studies done in the past around where there's positive mention of affordable housing in neighbourhood plans, delivery is consistently more. So how can we use our contacts and our experience to try and hook into those positive neighbourhood plans? And that's where we need local authorities to work with us, so that when they know there's positive neighbourhood plans, they can talk to us and we can start to look at how we focus our work in those areas. Not at the expense of others, but we might be able to get quicker wins. And overcoming objections and raising awareness. So this links into that sort of that NIMBY approach that we talked about, and how can we use our networks, the people that we work with all the time, to actually raise awareness of what's going on in rural areas. You know, I remember a few rural housing partnerships in the past had literally done things like a minibus full of parish councillors out to show people the really good work that's gone on in rural areas, so that when people talk about rural housing development, it's not some big bad concrete over the countryside, but they can see the high quality, sustainable development on the edge of villages and the difference that it makes in it. So how can we help local authorities with that awareness raising? Things like this, you know, sessions like this, but maybe more regionally based, with parishes, with the people who need to support affordable housing in order for it to then to come forward and be delivered. You know, we need to work together on that, I think. So really welcome your thoughts on how we can do that better. So moving on to the investment side. So costs. So as I mentioned earlier in response to another question, we look to benchmark appropriately. We look at each scheme individually. We do recognise that there are higher costs. If you look across the whole rural part of the programme, in general, you'll see that the costs are roughly similar in grant ask. However, if you look, the smaller the scheme, that changes, and it does become a slightly more expensive delivery, and we recognise that, and that's why we benchmark appropriately against other similar rural schemes, and we look at each scheme individually to make sure that we can you know, we can take a sensible view on that investment. So what I'd really encourage people to do is to talk to their local growth team contacts around specific schemes, to make sure that the earlier the communication on schemes happens, the sort of easier and more smoothly that conversation can run, and we can talk about what can be supported and what can't. So we also decided that we might be able to look at how we can join up on procurement work. Is there something that Homes England can do to help and facilitate procurement type clubs to help with realising the economies of scale that aren't always available for the smaller sites? So we know there are procurement clubs in existence all over the place. What can we do to support them and help them? Also, we want to support diversification of the market. So how can we get new providers in? Some small rurals we want to support. We want to support community-led organisations through our grant and investment programmes, and support them to access not just AHP, but what other things might be out there to help with that delivery. The scheme that I mentioned earlier, with talking about HBF unlocks part of the site, and then we're able to go with AHP in a different part of the scheme to deliver affordable. So diversifying that market will help us bring in other areas of our funding too. And with lending, we're going to be expanding our work with organisations like Council for Mortgage Lenders, individually with mortgage providers, and also with shared ownership mortgage brokers, just to see if we can encourage that financing on rural shared ownerships, and see where we might be able to help unblock some of that difficulty in getting lending on restricted rural schemes. Can we have the next slide, please? And then skills and capacity. So we have done a lot of work trying to map out, this is internally within Homes England, map out our investment, our current investment, overlaid with potential planning permissions, overlaid on our land that we have, and then overlaid on things like designated protected areas, designated rural areas, all those things that you heard about earlier on today. And that gives us quite a rich picture of what has gone on. And now we're looking at how we can make that sort of future-proof that, so that we can use that in our discussions with local authorities. It's not currently a thing that's open for everybody to use, but it will be open for us to use in our conversations with local authorities and with providers, so that we understand the sorts of activity that's going on in a particular area that you're working in. And I think that's a really useful piece of work that we're doing. Similar to that, we want to get a better picture of other areas of delivery through Homes England, so the land stuff and the loan stuff, and what we can do to help that. I talked earlier about the capacity of small housing associations. We have entered into strategic partnerships with over 30 large housing associations, and we're running things like forums to share knowledge between those, and we want to try and bring that together with smaller associations to see where we can match make and where we can help sort of bring the skills that are needed in the smaller associations together with the larger ones. A number of the larger ones have expressed quite an interest in working with both, working in rural areas, working with community-led organisations. So we're putting on forums to try and bring those together. Excuse me. Rural housing enablers and community-led hubs. We're looking at how we might be able to support them moving forward. This is ongoing work. There's not a great deal at the moment that we can say about it, but what can we do to encourage good quality rural housing enablers to be able to be supported? I know that DEFRA have also done some work on this at the moment. We don't know if anything will come out of that, but we recognise the value that some rural housing enablers can play in development, and so we're interested in what we might be able to do to help support that. We also want to look at where we can bring together the partnership working of local authorities in things like this. So this was one of the activities identified in the strategy to put on a session for local authorities. And as I said, this I feel is like making contact with as many as possible, so people can come and talk to us, to encourage people to keep coming to talk to us, because that will help us increase delivery and help us be able to help you to get more rural delivery ongoing. So there's a sort of a flavour of the kind of things that we've been looking at doing in this, and I hope that that we'll be able to continue sort of that conversation. I sort of put up a bit of a I haven't done many polls throughout this session, but the next slide will ask a question. Could you just put that next slide up, please? That's it. It would be really interesting to hear what things you might see as helping Homes England to increase rural delivery, and I think you can put in a word there, and we'll be able to take all this away with us, so that we can analyse it and look and get in touch with people as we move forward. So do that, and then it comes up as there we go. So that starts to come up as a word cloud up there. That's great. That's really useful. Funding. So I'm not sure. Can everybody see the poll things on there, or is it just me? But it's got.
Everyone should be able to see it.
That's great. That's really useful. So you can see the sort of issues that I've talked about are coming up again there. So, like I say, please do feel free to contact us to talk about these things, because we want to see the rural strategy that we're putting together. We haven't had a sort of dedicated rural strategy in Homes England or its predecessor organisations since about 2009-10. So it's really positive that I think as an organisation we're trying to get this done now, and it shows our commitment sort of moving forward to work in rural areas. So I haven't got too much else to say on that at the moment. So if we, I don't want to. There's still things coming in. That's great. That's brilliant. So yeah, so if I hand over to Alison, and then I'm happy to answer questions at the end. And thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Matt. That was great, and I'll reflect on some of the points that you've raised in my presentation. I've worked for English Rural for over 20 years now, and a bit like John this morning, before that I was one of the first rural housing enablers. So that unfortunately does age me quite considerably, but there we go. English Rural, for those of you who don't know us, are a rural specialist housing association, and we only work in small villages. We've heard all the various designations today, but we build affordable housing for local people. And today I want to talk about some of the challenges that we face and the opportunities to perhaps raise these. So my first slide, please. Oh, next slide. Right, we've had quite a few statistics today, and I'm not going to go through this particular slide in detail, but this information is reported in a pragmatics research report that English Rural, CPRE and the Rural Services Network commissioned probably a couple of years ago now, where they wanted to look at the economic and fiscal case for investment in new rural housing. And it's an excellent report, and I do believe can be sent out. A link can be sent out with the slides after the seminar. I mean, one statistic that sort of caught my eye when I was looking through it is that 10 new affordable homes in a rural community supports 26 jobs, producing £250,000 of tax income for the government. So I think, you know, it's important to look at this and the benefits that rural housing can bring to even the smallest of communities. Next slide, please. Right, land availability and cost. Historically, rural exception sites have been perhaps acquired at the round figure of £10,000 a plot. And for many years, these schemes were delivered on that basis. I think now we all appreciate that we have got to be a little bit more innovative in our land acquisitions to ensure that we can seriously engage with landowners. As far as English Rural are concerned, our land comes from various sources. Probably the majority are local landowners, farming or living in the community. We have in the past bought land from private estates and even the National Trust. Recently, we've done quite a bit of work with the Church Commissioners and Church of England Diocese, particularly since they launched their Coming Home report. And we've also purchased sites from local authorities, county councils and parish councils. So, you know, there is a range of landowners out there, and it's just really a matter of trying to tap into what is going to persuade them to sell. I think the difficulty we're up against a lot of the time is that with local authority call for sites, which particularly in the rural areas, a lot of our traditional rural exception sites are being put forward to be allocated in a local plan. And even if they're not accepted, it obviously has raised the aspiration on value from the landowner. So we do need to try and work with them and how we can persuade them to make land available. The cross subsidy policy has helped immensely, as I mentioned earlier on. And what we're finding is very supported by local communities is that English Rural, we use our cross subsidy as bungalows, and we build smaller bungalows and to enable local people to downsize. And this has been very much supported by communities. And we always offer 3 months local marketing before it goes to the wider market. And I have to say that virtually all of our open market bungalows have been sold to local people. So it's created another level of homes in that community. other ways that landowners are talking to us. They're saying, well, look, I'd be quite happy to give land for 6 or 8 affordable homes if I could have a plot for myself or for my son or daughter. And I think that's something we are exploring now. And I think it would be good for local planning authorities to perhaps appreciate that cross-subsidy might not always be from an open market sale, but might be come forward from such plots as this, whether it be as a custom build plot, or actually including that a property for that landowner within the development. It's certainly something to explore. We think that the important factor in identifying sites in rural communities is it very much has to be the involvement of the local community. I mean, we very much encourage parish councils and community land trust to actually carry out the initial site search to look at their village and surrounds and to see what possible plots are available. We can then assess them, their feasibility, and then we look to submit those sites to the local authority so that the planning policy officers can give their comments on the suitability of the site. I mean, the comments of the local authority and the parish council don't always meet, and sometimes we have to take forward a site that perhaps isn't top of the list or of the more suitable because it's not available. That sort of transparent site search is really important, and it does, at the stage of a planning application or wider community consultation, gives you an answer to those perhaps objecting to the proposal. Well, why did you choose this site? How did it come about? And it's good to show that there's been that sequential approach. Next slide, please. So the infrastructure of sites, I mean, rural exception sites by their very nature are often in difficult locations. They may not have all main services, and so you need to incorporate in your feasibility whether you might require a private treatment sewage plant, whether there's mains gas, or you're looking at perhaps air source heat pumps, and you're working that into your preliminary viability. But interestingly, even when the top trumps come up and the site you've selected actually does have all main services, it doesn't always go right in the end. I mean, for example, in a village in Kent recently, there was main drainage, but unfortunately it wasn't in the road or where the site faced. It was in the rear gardens of the houses who lived opposite, and of course they were main objectors, so we knew there would be no opportunity for us to be able to get permission to tap into the main drainage system there. So we had to look at a private sewage treatment plant. So it can be challenging on lots of things. Interestingly, in that same village, we had promised the local community that we would install air source heat pumps, even though there was mains gas in the village. It was something that Parish Council was very keen on, and English Rural is looking to include more and more air source heat pumps in our developments. And so that was agreed. And once the build work started on site, UK Power Network connected the landlord supply, but then informed us that actually if we wanted air source heat pumps, a whole new upgrading of supply and substation would be required at a cost of probably 130,000. This would go across 2 landowners' fields, so we'd need to get their permission and obviously pay their costs to actually have those diversions in place. And it just proved totally financially unviable to continue along that route. So the parish council, whilst reluctant, appreciated we would need to go back to the option of gas, but we could look at including solar panels on the roof to sort of, go towards that renewable energy target for them. Next slide, please. We've talked today about government policies, and I just wanted to touch on a couple. The first homes policy, and we talked, John this morning talked about designated rural areas, and I do think it's something that local authorities could look at as whether they actually submit to have more of their parishes included in the section 157 of the 1985 Housing Act, so that they are a designated rural area. I know that South Somerset Council recently undertook that process and was successful, and of course that does give the rural exception sites more protection from things like first homes, and I think, you know, we need to look at how this first homes develops, but I think if local authorities could think about that, that would be a real help. And I think the other thing I just wanted to mention is the right to buy, and I think, you know, English rural, you know, none of our homes has ever been lost to the open market, and we plan to keep it that way. Our residents will not have a right to buy. I mean, obviously we look at the voluntary right to buy and people porting over their discount, but I do think it's really important to the communities in where we're building that we can say to them, these homes will be here for future generations. Next slide, please. A couple of the speakers have touched on NIMBYism and objectors, and in my opinion, it is a key challenge and a key constraint to bringing forward rural housing. I mean, 25 years ago, we had NIMBYs, yes, but we had small consultations in village halls, and people would come along and have a shout or whatever, and then go away. But I think now with social media, we have, you know, concentrated groups, action groups being created to fight housing in their village. And unfortunately, sometimes rural housing gets lost in allocated sites, and people are opposing things without perhaps appreciating what they are. So during the COVID pandemic, we introduced online consultation, and with a dedicated website for that village, showing the plans we propose, setting out all the information, and allowing people to comment. And actually, parish councils and community land trusts who we are working with were pleased with this. We were able to run this website for 4 weeks, go back to them on a weekly basis, letting them know how many people had looked at the plans, what the comments were, and they found that really helpful without having that confrontation that can be very difficult for people who want one of these homes to actually speak out in a public setting. So I do think that, you know, it is the way forward. We have got to work together, and I think, you know, it's a shame that often a small vocal minority can actually stop something or concern the parish council that they perhaps lose their nerve to continue with a project. Objectors will endeavour to influence local politicians, and I think local authorities, you know, can provide support to their members, reassuring that the policies are in place. I mean, it's not unusual for us to have 100 objections to a planning application, even when we've done, you know, a massive amount of community consultation. But because we have actually produced a planning application that meets all material objectives, then, you know, we are successful when it comes to committee. And so it's really a matter of sticking at it, unfortunately. Next slide, please. This I think is maybe you know, an issue not just for rural housing. I mean, I don't know, some of my fellow registered providers will say that, you know, we are appreciative that, you know, there is sometimes a capacity issue in local planning departments, and so therefore applications are sort of getting stuck in for longer than we would hope for. And I think one of the things that we've had discovered is that because there is such a long lead-in time to rural schemes, and that you're working with planning officers right at the very beginning in the preliminary site search, planning officers are then maybe moving on. And when you get to the planning application stage, which might be 3 or 4 years later, there's different officers in place who perhaps have different views and actually want you to revisit the site search to see, just to establish that this is the best site. And, you know, that's time consuming, and it's disappointing that, you know, there seems to be this accepted understanding that rural schemes will take a long time. And it's one of my biggest frustrations, you know, when I have a project that goes through in 2 or 3 years, that's amazing. And then when you get planning consent on one that's been going for 7 years, you know, you're elated, but you do think, gosh, you know, that took some going. And that'll be one of the reasons why a lot of registered providers are no longer really considering to do rural. So we do need to look at how we can increase the capacity in the local planning authorities. Next slide, please. This is just one of 2 slides which details, and I'm not saying this is just for rural schemes, but details the level of reports and surveys and everything required to support a planning application on a rural exception site. I mean, a couple of the things that, you know, that can take up a lot of our time and fun fees is wildlife. You know, we do an awful lot amount on ecology, and I've got a scheme at the moment whereby there is a lot of reptiles on our site. So in fact, there's too many to relocate to the other part of the field. So we need to look for a receptor site, and it's taken us almost as long to find a receptor site for the slow worms as it did to find the site for the affordable homes. But we were very fortunate that a local trust with a land and an interest in ecology has agreed to make available a couple of acres for us to relocate our slow worms and grass snakes. But, you know, that doesn't come without a cost. And so far, and we haven't got planning yet or started the work, you know, we've spent nearly £20,000 on the preliminary work. So again, it's that sort of process does slow up the application. Next slide, please. And again, just more supports requirements, you know, things like heritage statements. I mean, when you get the comments from your consultation events, particularly from those who are objecting, they'll always, you know, their key comments are, oh, the roads are too narrow, the traffic, you know, the village can't take any more traffic, regardless of the fact this is a scheme for local people. So a lot of that traffic will already be there. So it is a matter of education and trying to ensure that your planning application has every possible aspect covered to get it to committee. Next slide, please. Matt talked about continuous market engagement process, and that's the route that English Rural take. It means that we're able to run our own development programme, and we're also able to discuss with our programme managers at Homes England, you know, our pipeline of projects that are coming forward, so that we can be talking to them about the difficulties we feel this site might bring forward, the constraints, the costs that might be involved. So we have this ongoing conversation with Homes England, perhaps for 2 years before we actually get the planning and submit a formal bid on IMS. And, you know, we're all aware of the process of getting the funding and the grant claims. And next slide, please. The final step from that is actually having an audit on that scheme and providing all the documents that will be required to support, you know, the grant that you've received. Next slide, please. So this is my final slide, and I want to sort of try and end on an upbeat note with opportunities. I mean, at English Rural, we're delighted that Homes England are focusing on a strong rural strategy, and I think, you know, Matt has discussed that really well, and it will be something that, you know, we're hoping will bring forward more rural schemes. The role of the rural housing enablers, in my mind, is absolutely essential, and that wasn't just because I was one, but, you know, I think the independence that they offer in carrying out housing needs surveys does help with the planning side. You know, it gives comfort to planning officers that this is an independent housing need identified. And although, and I know a lot of rural housing enablers were getting their funding through the Community Housing Fund. Now that's obviously finished at the moment. So I think their continued funding is something that local authorities, Homes England and registered providers need to support. Matt again also talked about unlocking unused sector capacity. I mean, this is something that English Rural has been exploring, and unlocking capacity that smaller housing associations might have in respect of land that they've got, or funding reserves that they have, but don't have the expertise or experience to bring forward the housing that's needed. And as an example, we partnered recently with Greyshot Housing Association that had stock dating back to the 30s. A lot of it wasn't suitable by today's standards. And they had reserves to build on some of this stock that had large gardens. And so we worked with them as their development agent, and six properties were demolished and 16 built in their place. And, you know, that was a tremendous success. And the help that we were able to give them, not just running the development programme, but also with the consultation that they needed to do, not just in the community, but with their residents. We do need to improve relationships with landowners. And interestingly, yesterday I had a meeting with the head of strategic land investment at the Church Commissioners, because we'd recently got planning consent with a community land trust on land that the Church Commissioners owned. And they were delighted. It was a long slog, and they were delighted that the permission has come through, and that they're very much looking forward to deliver more rural exception sites. And, you know, they want to work with a range of partners. So I thought that was very exciting. I mean, their coming home report isn't just focused to the diocese at Church of England, but the Church Commissioners as well. So they themselves are trying to speed up that process. I think, again, you know, local landowners, we need to find out what it is they want, what will persuade them, incentivize them to release a site in a village. And then we need to try and talk to our stakeholder partners and see if we can persuade them to accept that. I mean, a parish council I spoke to on Monday said, we'd rather have some housing than no housing. And if it means that there are two open market, or the landowner gets a property, that's fine. At least we still get some affordable homes for our local people. How we encourage new providers to develop. Again, I think the Homes England work that they're doing on their rural strategy, hopefully that will reinforce that to other providers to look at delivering in rural areas. Shifting the focus. I mean, it does feel like there's been a bit of a shift from Homes England and government to consider non-monetary values, you know, increased emphasis on place and wider values that affordable homes can bring to a community, sustaining that rural community and improving people's lives and security. So maybe historically investment has been driven by grant per unit, but, you know, although it's still a factor, I feel that, you know, we are now looking at wider issues, and that's good, and you know, that our partners will be listening to that. Finally, reputation and quality, and I think that's for all of us really. I mean, the quality of the homes that we build are superb. I mean, I look at not just ones that English Rural deliver, but other rural housing associations. I mean, you saw some this morning. You know, we are building high quality homes in lovely areas, and they are providing truly affordable homes for local people, sustaining those rural communities, and the reputation that we can, by saying these homes will be here for future generations. I think that is just such a key message to take forward. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thanks, Alison. Wonderful. And yeah, brilliant. If you could turn off your microphone, that's fantastic. I'm constantly hearing echoes myself, but that was wonderful. And what we're going to do now is have a go at answering some of your questions. So thank you so much. There's an awful lot in the chat there, and we'll have a little go at answering them. What I'm going to start off with are a number of questions that came in this morning, and we didn't have time to answer them all. So the first two are going to be relating to the exception site issue, and I'd like Matt to answer those if possible. So we've got the first question: what determines where a rural exception site can be developed? If you could start us off, that would be great. I keep saying wonderful. It'll be great, not wonderful. Thank you.
Well, local policies will have the biggest say over where rural exception sites can be done. There will be a local exception site policy and that a local authority would have. I mean, generally rural exception sites are on the edge of settlements just outside the development boundary, and traditionally were there to deliver affordable housing and wouldn't have got planning permission for other types of housing, and that's sort of the nature of the rural exception site. So but certainly local planning policies will determine where that route is available. I don't know if anyone wants to add anything on that. No, that's good then.
That sounds like a no. Okay, great. Now, related to that, we've got a question here again from this morning. If a local authority's evidence base is outdated, is it expected that the RP developer commissions the housing needs survey for entry-level exception sites? I was wondering, Matt, if you could pick that up or offer some idea of where you could signpost people to.
Well, so initially entry-level exception sites are kind of going out. They're disappearing and changing into first homes exception sites. So that's a slightly different thing. As for housing needs surveys, they're generally required to demonstrate a need to get planning permission for a rural exception site, and that's sort of one of the requirements generally needed in to get those planning permissions. So who's you know that where a rural housing enabling partnership is in place, they're a really useful way, because there the sort of partnership might work between registered providers and local authorities covering a particular area, and they will have worked out what housing needs surveys will be done in that area across a specific period of time, and that's what they're putting their money into that partnership for. But in other words, there's different types of routes I think that can go down. I don't know if one of our RP colleagues today here might want to just talk about what they do in a situation where no housing needs survey exists.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that, Matt. Yeah, we have to find a way to get one done. So it'll either be commissioned by the housing association, commissioned by the landowner. Often the landowner will do that at risk because they realise that's what's needed to unlock the evidence base. But it needs to be done independently. And like I say, a rural housing enabler, or where there's not an enabler, we carry those out as Midlands rural housing. But yeah, often the landowner will take the risk on those.
If I might, I mean, yeah, we work very closely with rural housing enablers. So our projects are virtually always started by that housing needs survey carried out in the community. I don't know if it might be a bit different in the southeast, Richard, but I think planning officers in local authorities would struggle to support a planning application for a rural exception site if there wasn't more of an independent housing needs survey carried out. Although I do accept that, you know, ones carried out by housing associations are equally just as valid and landowners, but it is a bit more of an issue we find.
Yeah, we do it slightly different, and we do it as Midlands Rural Housing, so it's independent of another housing association that carries it out. But we support rural housing enablers. We fund enablers across the Midlands, but where there are gaps, we can help step in and do the independent assessments.
Wonderful. That was a very comprehensive set of answers there. Thank you. Right. So the next question, if we go back to Matt, and perhaps John can help with this. To give us a Homes England perspective, and then maybe Richard, Alison, I could see whether they've got anything else to bring from your perspective. So the question is, are there elements of funding or other funding sources to enhance the carbon offsetting of a new development? I wonder, Matt, would you like to start us off there?
I'm not 100% sure. I don't believe that the if we're talking about the AHP, then it's a very specific fund to deliver the affordable homes. So there wouldn't be anything through that. I'm not aware of other funding currently around carbon offsetting. I don't, John, do you know of any? Not within Homes England.
Not carbon offsetting.
No.
So no, the current programme has got ambition and targets around MMC, but that's not
indirectly.
Carbon indirectly is it, you know, it's a very indirect kind of route through, but it's not directly linked to carbon within the current programme as I understand it.
I know the National Housing Federation are doing a lot of work on net zero, so it may be worth getting in touch with them and seeing sort of what they're doing around this, because I've certainly been at sessions where they've talked about that they're sort of putting quite a lot of time into this. So they might be a contact where you can find out more about the offsetting stuff.
Great, that's useful signposting. What about Richard, Alison? Do you have any further thoughts on other funding streams?
Yeah, as far as yes. Sorry, Victoria. Yes, as far as I'm aware, there isn't any separate funding to offset carbon zero. I mean, we have a retrofit programme, and there's funding for that, and we're replacing old night storage heaters with air source heat pumps. So there's funding for that. So I think really it's just a matter of including it in your viability and discussing it with Homes England when you're looking at, you know, getting grant for it. I mean, we're all working towards targets, but as I say, it's a balance really of achieving the homes and at the best environment standard that you can produce. I don't know what you think, Richard.
Yeah, similar. I mean, things like the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund is all around existing stock, so not new development as such. But a long shot, but it is worth, you know, looking at what local authorities in each area have, what their priorities are, corporate objectives, because they may be able to match fund or put some sort of funding in if there is some sort of carbon offset. But yeah, mostly around existing stock at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Okay, fantastic. I think related to that, there's the question in here that again we could do some signposting too if we don't have the exact answer. And again, this is for Matt and John. Would Homes England consider higher grant levels to support affordable social rent and improved energy efficiency in expensive rural areas? So again, I think this is referring to flexibilities within AHP.
I put an answer to the question in the chat, but just social rent can be funded in certain parts of the country depending on the affordability ratios, and there is a department list of those areas where social rent is available and can take extra grant to deliver it. So it depends where you are. And again, it's really important to talk to your local Homes England contact to determine that.
Okay, fantastic. Right, since you're there, Matt, another question for you around rural housing enablers. And also referring to rural housing needs study. So I think that there are two questions here around what Homes England funding can be used for. So the first one is, would Homes England fund a rural housing needs study in a local area? And the second one would be, might Homes England put some funding into rural housing enablers? I think we know that AHP is obviously a capital grant and cannot be used for anything other than scheme-specific expenditure. But I just wondered whether, Matt, you knew of anything else within the agency that could be offered, or any good examples of partnership working where somehow local authorities, RPs, have found a way to offer enabling capacity.
So yeah, so you're right on the AHP is a capital funding, and it's very specific about what can and can't be funded, and the capital funding guide is the place to look for what types of on costs are available as part of that capital funding. As far as partnerships go, I think we see sort of three main ways that rural housing enablers can try and fund themselves: through the sort of partnership route, where registered providers and local authorities put in bits of money. That happens in certain areas of the country, and then they expect a sort of service on from the rural housing enabler. So that'll be a certain amount of housing needs surveys in that area, and also that partnership brings people together to sort of do that matchmaking process that I was talking about earlier, matching providers to sites and all that. And where that works really well. On top of that, some rural housing enabling partnerships try and get funding through a sort of small roof tax on top of so a scheme that's delivered. Every home has a certain amount of money if it's being delivered through work that the RHE has done. A small amount of money might go back into the partnership per home delivered. And also RHEs have tried to find funding through their own sort of paid for activity, so housing needs surveys outside of where the partnership has agreed survey should take place, for example. So there's different ways of funding, and I think at the moment there isn't a great deal of support, certainly through the AHP, for that. We can support through other means, perhaps through working with the partnerships. We find them a really useful body to liaise with on rural housing delivery, because it brings people together in one area. So our work with them could support those partnerships through that. So I would say, yeah, the capital funding guide is the guide for what sort of things can be done, and it's not really directly fundable. I'm not sure whether other parts of the business can as yet fund those sort of things through I think that the difficulty is, as always, that it's revenue funding. But what I would say is there is certainly recognition, or more recognition, coming through from some government departments about the value of rural housing enabling. And I think that's really positive. Although there's nothing yet attached to that, it is a positive move, and we'll be working with them to see if anything can come from it.
Brilliant. And I think the message would be for local authorities to speak to the relationship managers within the Markets, Partners and Places team, and also with their AHP growth colleagues as well. Fantastic. Great. Thank you. Right. Here's a question for Richard and Alison. So this has come up a few times in the chat. There are a number of points around landowner expectations and the challenge of the long view that's taken by many. So can you, Richard and Alison, offer your thoughts and share any useful insights and experiences around this? Who would like to go first?
Right, I'll go first. I did touch on this in my presentation about landowners' expectations on land value and releasing. And I do think, as I said, that we do need to be innovative and in how we work with them to acquire sites, and often it's just a matter of trying to sort of discern what it is they're looking for. Are they wanting a long-term view? Are they, you know, often what you can say to a landowner is, okay, if they've got a big land holding, well, you know, look at this as your sort of loss leader in a way. Let this rural exception site go forward, and, you know, maybe the next sort of local plan review, you might be able to get another part of the of land allocated. But as I said, you know, a lot of them now are just either looking for a very high land value, which we're not able to offer, and they will say, okay, well, we'll sit on it for 20 years and wait until then, or, you know, they want something now. A property, as I say, we've had several landowners where if they could have a property for one of their children who lives in the community, then they would happily gift the land. And I do really think that that's something that, you know, we do consider, and it may be a way to delivering more. You know, we do need landowners, and we have to listen to what it is they're actually wanting.
Fantastic, thank you. Richard, would you like to come in there?
Yeah, I completely agree. It's about the communication with landowners, understanding their needs, sometimes playing the long game with them as well, or as Alison says, you know, trying to see what their interests are, what they could possibly gain from it. But every case is different. We find by building relations with landowners, after a while, you know, they do see the community's benefit. As Alison says, you know, working with Church of England recently, working with the landed estates, they tend to have a sort of long-term interest and a social interest in rural communities, so you can sort of tug on the heartstrings and sort of play to that sort of community benefit. And traditionally, I mean, it's very, you know, rural housing, isn't it? But farmland obviously is a fantastic source, and they have a lot of it, and they see the benefits of local people being housed. They need people to work in their farms, and that still is a great source of land for us. But yeah, sometimes it's a case of, you know, going away and then going back to them 4 or 5 years later, and if they're challenged, the local authority's 5-year plan hasn't worked, they may be open to discussions around an exception site. So there's a whole different patchwork of land availability out there. It's just keeping the plates spinning and keeping the clear lines of communication open to see what possible opportunities there are for solutions.
Fantastic, brilliant. Can I go back to Matt now with another Homes England more practical question? This question came up twice in slightly different guises. How can we see what rural schemes grant levels we can benchmark against? Now, we don't generally share grant level benchmarking. Maybe you could offer some ideas there.
Well, I feel bad saying the same thing again, but it really is about talking to your local local contacts about schemes at an early at a sort of as earlier in the process as possible, and then talking about that. I think that's the best way, because, like you say, we don't have a X amount per unit that is the local benchmark. It's not how we do things, because we want to ensure that we're looking at schemes in a bit more detail and working through them like that. So yeah, come and talk to us about it, and we can work through the scheme. Yeah,
fantastic. And making the case for that higher grant rate if needed. Wonderful.
Yeah, so we can best understand the sort of nature of the scheme, and you know, that's the thing about rural areas, that they can be pretty varied, and although there are issues across, you know, lots of rural delivery, each individual little bit has its own unique issues as well. So that's why we want to talk to you about it, rather than just saying a X amount here and there.
Brilliant, thank you. Right, fantastic. So I think we've got time for one last question, or maybe two if we're quick. Alison, you did refer to right to buy, and there are a few queries that came in related to knowing how you deal with right to buy as a housing association in more detail. And I wonder if you could offer some further thoughts, and then maybe Richard might like to come in there as well.
Yes, of course. I mean, all of our rural exception sites will be, have a Section 106 agreement attached, which will set out the local criteria required to occupy one of the homes, and will say that it needs to remain in that community in perpetuity. So consequently, our tenancy agreements will say that there is no right to buy on this particular development. Now, when the voluntary right to buy came in, our board decided that we still wouldn't offer the right to buy, and we wouldn't be persuaded to, because I think it's a letdown to the communities who've perhaps spent a long time getting this scheme in their community. There may be no other site. I mean, we've talked about the difficulties of land. To actually lose those homes in small rural communities would be very difficult. But obviously what we are able to do is to work with a resident who wants to use their right to buy and port their discount to another development. Now, obviously, there are still pilots going on at the moment as to how that might work. And I'm not sure how it would work, because they've either would have to move away from the community where no doubt they want to stay. And so that it'd be difficult for them. I mean, I'll be perfectly honest, we've never had an application for a right to buy on any one of our developments. I think so. I appreciate it's there, but I do think it is really important for rural that we can always say our homes will remain here in perpetuity for future generations. Otherwise, a lot of the landowners, it will be lost.
Thank you. That's powerful. Richard, do you have any further thoughts?
Yeah, the same reasons we opted out. The boards of our associations decided not to enter the voluntary right to buy pilot for the same reasons. We'd break the promises we made to communities about these homes being affordable in perpetuity. And yeah, we'd never replace those homes on a like-for-like basis. And then, yeah, we've got hard enough problems, getting hold of land. But if landowners think, well, you're charging exception site values, but actually these could be lost to the open market in the future, we just wouldn't have any landowners wanting to do business with us. So no, it was something that our boards were certainly not keen to get involved with.
Okay, great, thank you. Right, I think we do have time for one last question, and I think John, Richard, this might be one for you. John, maybe you could start us off. So the question is, do you always need parish council surveys to carry out a needs survey? John, do you want to start us off?
Do we always need the parish council's permission? I think I'll start by saying there's the mechanical, evidential aspect of a housing needs survey. So that the local planning authority, the planning officer that will be making a decision or a recommendation rather to planning committee will need evidence that there is a local need that's got a local connection in order to bring forward land that's outside of the allocations within the local plan for affordable housing. So there's that mechanical process and that evidence base that needs to be gathered. What I would suggest though is that the housing needs survey is a wonderful opportunity to open up the debate and take on the naysayers head on around bringing forward affordable homes for local people with a local connection. So that it's the opportunity to kind of take a can opener to that conversation with local people, local residents, the parish council, and all those that have a stake in and around a particular settlement. Now, I don't say that lightly. I've been myself in those difficult parish council meetings and into local authority planning committees where objections have been voiced. So I've witnessed that firsthand. But I think to attempt to circumvent the parish council is probably not a helpful tactic, and every attempt should be made to bring the parish council along with that process, who will be the parish council will be a consultee as a planning application moves forward. Richard, I don't know whether you have any further thoughts on the real coalface of getting there. getting schemes through and accepted at a local level?
Yeah, I mean, yes, plenty of years, like I say, on the front line, but yeah, it's the first step in the process. You're right. You know, we need to engage parish councils. We need to then go further and engage the community. Local authorities are the key first step. And if a local authority doesn't support a housing needs survey for a certain reason, then it would never take place. If a parish council objected, then again, it's about spending that time communicating with them, talking to them about, you know, this is not a done deal. We'll do a survey. We'll come back. We'll consult with you and the community about possible solutions, and winning them round. So it is that first step in terms of education, knowledge enhancements around affordable housing. And yeah, we've had some difficult conversations, but we've never really been blocked by a parish council because they see the value in it, and then we have more conversations once the results are in. So yeah, I think they need to be taken along, and the vast majority understand and are supportive. But in certain circumstances, you know, that there can be tough conversations to be had.
Can I just add something in there, please, Victoria? A couple of local authorities in Kent have actually introduced a rolling programme of housing needs surveys. And so they're sort of selling the idea by, we are going to commission at the Rural Housing and Labour to do a housing needs survey in all of our parishes over 5 years. So that way there's, you know, that whilst the parish council might say no, because it's part of a rolling programme, it's been easier for the local authority to introduce that, and so that might be a way round to any objections.
Brilliant. Some fantastic insights and shared experiences there, and more examples of great partnership working as well. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I think we're going to have to draw the Q&A to a close. So thank you very, very much. This is take-home messages for you, some top tips from the speakers, and also some information about the organisations that are involved today, and some wider reading to help you. Next slide, please. So if you have any further questions that haven't been answered, please email us. Also, there's a survey in the chat. Please take 5-10 minutes with a cup of coffee, cup of tea, and let us know what you thought. And that'll also ask in more detail, what would you like from us in the future? So thank you all. Thanks once again, in particular to Alison and Richard for your fabulous insights. And thanks for sticking around today. Goodbye.